Excited to be here using the new Special Edition 475, which is one of two new machines that Bernina have launched this year in collaboration with Kaffe Fassett, who everybody knows is a master of colour. So it's nice to see some colourful machines. When you get a chance, do take a look at the other machine, which is the 770 on the main stand, and you'll see that it's lovely and colourful, just like this one. So what I wanted to share with you all today is just some improvised techniques. For those of you that don't know, my name is Nicholas and I'm an improvised quilter. So unlike the amazing quilts that you can see on the wall today, my quilts don't follow a set pattern. So I very rarely use specific lists of measurements or instructions. So I just kind of sew in a much more organic, liberated way. And I've been doing that for about 7 years now. So I've been quilting for 10, but working in an improvised way for about 7. In 2019, I published my book, and what we're going to be looking at today is one of the techniques from that book. So I'm going to be showing you a really quick technique that is great for adding impact to your quilting. So it's what I would call an insert technique. So we're going to be looking at taking strips and inserting them into larger pieces of fabric. And I explore inserts in lots of different ways. But I particularly like this method because it almost acts as a kind of stained glass, sort of fractured look. And the great thing about improvised quilting is we're not going to measure anything. We're just kind of going to roll with it and do it ad hoc. And you'll see that the blocks themselves can be scaled up and down really, really easily without any measuring. And I'm using the Kaffe fabric. And what I love about that is because Kaffe is known for his big, bold designs, we can do something like this where we're making lots of cuts in the fabric, but we can still see these amazing florals that Kaffe designs. So you can almost isolate those, if you like, as little panes of stained glass. So we're going to start off by showing you what you need. And as I said, there's no measuring. So what you want to do is just have a piece of background fabric. And a question I get asked a lot in my workshop, the hand go up and they say, what size is that background fabric? It really is as big or as small as you want it to be. And there are a couple of things that you need to bear in mind. So we're going to be inserting strips into this piece of fabric. So every time we make a cut in this, we're going to lose 1/4 of an inch on either side of that cut. So this fabric is going to shrink down. And the more cuts we make, the more the fabric is going to shrink. So when I make something like this, I generally oversize, put all of the inserts into it, and then use a square ruler to trim it down to a size. So just bear that in mind. When you're thinking, right, I want to play with this technique, oversize your starting block. Now, I can't tell you by how much, because people will have a varying amounts of cuts that they want to make. So just remember that every time you put one of these strips in, you're going to lose 1/2 inch from the fabric. So just bear that in mind. And then for the inserts themselves, this is where you get to add a little bit of creativity and individuality. You're going to be wanting to use strips. Now, these can be cut from width of fabric, they can be cut from scraps that you might have, and I'm a fan of a narrower strip. So these are cut at just over 3/4 of an inch. So when we sew this into the background fabric, we'll lose 1/2 inch, and we'll have a strip that is just over 1/4 of an inch. And that gives you something like that. Now, of course, these strips can be any width you want. What I would suggest is the bigger the background piece, the bigger the strips. If you try and put really, really narrow strips in a large piece of background fabric, it can sometimes get lost. As well as the width of those strips, what's important is the fabric that you choose. Because if you choose something that doesn't contrast very well, you're not going to be able to see those lines that you've taken the time to put in. So I'm a fan of using loud, bold fabrics, like Kaffe's, and then coupling that perhaps with a solid for the insert fabric, because the solid gives the eye somewhere to rest. It stands out against the busier prints of the background. You can, of course, reverse that. So you could use a solid background and use prints for your insert. So I would encourage you to kind of play with color and value, but just make sure that these have enough contrast against whatever it is you're using for the background. So once you've decided on your background fabric and you've got your strips cut, you want to sort of just lay your background piece on a cutting mat. Now, full disclosure, this is ridiculously small. Now, normally I would be at home and I would have a larger cutting mat. Guess who forgot to bring their larger cutting mat? So this is the one that I travel with. So you'll see that it's it's too small really, because what we'll be doing is cutting from the edge to start with. So ideally you will have a bigger cutting mat. And also I'm demonstrating on top of an original Kaffe quilt, which I'm quite nervous about. So I'm definitely gonna stop before. And I would normally press my seams with an iron next to my sewing machine. I don't want to do that on Kaffe's quilt, just in case. And I've had experiences in the past where my quilts have been burned by an unattended iron in a workshop. So I know the pain of that. So we're gonna finger press today. So we're gonna put our background fabric right sides up onto our cutting mat. And this isn't any real difficult technique. It's very simple, but the way that you explore with it then is how you can really individualize your patchwork. So I have the background fabric right sides up, and what I'm going to do is just take my ruler and make a cut. Forgot to get the ruler out. There's always something that you forget, isn't there? You could of course use scissors. You don't have to use a ruler. This can be done in a freehand way with scissors. But just make a cut from one side to the other. And I'm quite lazy, so you can see that this is quite creased and I haven't ironed that, and ordinarily I wouldn't iron it. So anywhere from one edge to the other, and be daring in your cuts. Try not to keep everything perfectly straight. Add a little bit of wonk there and it'll multiply across the block and it'll just make it look that little bit more interesting. So from one end to the other, not cutting through Kaffe's quilt, and just separate it out like that. And then you just want to break down these into sections, and the number of sections is entirely up to you. Again, remember, with each cut you are losing some fabric. So I just like to turn, and I may want to put one there, and then I like to go opposite. So try not to have all the cuts going in the same direction. So turn your ruler and make perhaps a cut there. And keep the pieces on your mat so that you can see where you've made these cuts. Obviously your mat will be much bigger, so that will be easier for you. And then what I like to do is try and do opposite to where I've done before. So I wouldn't go there because that's going to make a nice sort of parallel line, which we want to sort of break this up a bit more. So kind of go opposite to what you've done. So I could go across here and then maybe split this one into two, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. And once you've made as many cuts as you like, you're going to leave all of those on your cutting mat. And I'm going to try to hold this up so that people can see how I've done that there. The next step is to then get your insert fabric, and for time saving I like to cut from width of fabric. You don't have to, but the longer the strips you can just keep reusing that one strip. And I like to cut all of this to size first before I sew anything. And I use scissors for this. So we want a little bit of extra on the top and bottom, not too much, just a little bit to give us a bit of wiggle room. And you're essentially filling in these lines. So starting here, overlap, and then just trim so that it's about 1/4 of an inch bigger either end. It's not an exact science, but thereabouts. And then do the same for all of the cuts that you've made. So filling in, almost like the lead, if you like, of a stained glass. Like that. And then eventually you'll have that long seam that we started with. So once you've got to that stage, we now need to put all this back together, and there is an order that we need to sew it in. So for example, we wouldn't be able to sort of sew this piece to that piece until we've made this a whole. So looking at your design that you've made, you just want to break it apart and sort of spread it out. So you're going to have the two halves, and then looking at these are quite simple, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then on this side, those have to become one unit before they can join that one. So depending on the number of cuts, it'll take you a little while to figure it out. But once you have it figured out, take one of the pieces, and remember these are right sides together now. With this solid, it's quite difficult to tell the right sides. But if I was using a print, it would be right sides together. And your 1/4 of an inch seam is not as important in something like this. So if you're sewing slightly under or slightly over, please don't waste time unpicking it because it doesn't matter. It can also add interest if you actually vary your seam allowance slightly, because these become slightly in and out, so it looks more organic. It looks like a grout line or a lead on a stained glass window, something like that. But right sides together, and then just stitching, and all it is a simple straight stitch. So if you can't see my hands, you're not missing anything. And I'm just going to stitch that down. And then I press as I go. So ordinarily I would use my iron, but we're not going to burn the quilt. So we're just going to finger press that open. I generally tend to press towards what we're calling the lead fabric or the grout fabric. Depending on how narrow those are, you may have cut them quite small. If you press both seams towards that, you're going to have some sort of overlap. So you can either grade the seam by trimming a little bit of away, or press one seam towards the fabric and then press the next seam away from this inner fabric. But you can do that, approach that sort of in a way that works best for you. Everybody has pressing preferences that they prefer. So I'm just finger pressing that now to give something that looks like that. And you can see I've pressed towards this insert fabric here. And then I will take my next piece of the jigsaw puzzle, and I know that that goes there. Now, if you're sewing with an accurate 1/4 inch seam, what you want to do is offset these two lines here by a 1/4 inch, because if you don't, they will shift down like that, and you'll have to trim off a little bit more. As I said, I'm very lazy, so I just kind of eyeball it and stick it in. But you can offset this point from this edge here by a 1/4 inch seam, and when you press that out, they'll be perfectly aligned. But the principle is the same. Right sides together, aligning it on that edge, and then stitching that down. And then that will give me a better opportunity to show you the back and the seams that we create. So just stitching that down. Like so. And looking at the back, you can see that if I press that now towards this insert fabric, there's just enough space for them to nestle neatly together, so that's not creating any additional bulk. If I cut these slightly narrower, we would now have an overlap on that center point, which would create a little bit more bulk than we may want. So what you may want to do is press one towards the same direction so that they don't overlap. Of course, if you're using wider strips, and again, these can be as wide as you want them to be, pressing towards the center after about an inch, they won't meet. So I would press the seam, and you'll see now that we have some overhang, and I deal with all of that at the end, or when I come to join the pieces together. I don't trim any of that at this point. And then I just repeat the process. So I would take this one, and whether you sew that to that piece first or the whole is entirely up to you. But I would just work my way through the pieces. And if you're brave, you can chain piece these. So you can take the next piece, perhaps this one, and save yourself some thread and some time by just lifting up your presser foot, not cutting the thread, and chain piecing in that way. And you would carry on for all the pieces. The only thing then is you have to remember where they go. So you may want to snap a picture on your phone just so that you can remember. But you would work your way through, and then you put them back where they were, and then take the next section. So we can now take this piece and put it along there. Again, just looking where these two align. I eyeball it again, I'm very impatient. And then just stitch that down. And you would repeat this for as many inserts as you have made. And then what you'll eventually end up with is two halves of the piece. So we have the one half finished there. We would put that back and we would carry on. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 seams left. So I'll whiz through these seams and we'll have a finished block. So again, chain piecing if you want to. cutting them from the chain. And now when you have to join a piece that has a little sticky out bit, that's where we then need to tidy up that edge. So I would just give myself a new straight sewing edge, and that can now get attached to that. And just be careful when you are stitching these pieces that have already been sewn, you've got the seams, so just sew them in the direction that they've been pressed. And you can see my 1/4 inch seam is not perfect, but I quite like the character that it adds.
I was going to ask that, but it happens if your seam's a little bit wobbly.
Yes, a little bit wobbly. I mean, it adds a little bit of character, so I'm not too bothered by it. I just caught that there, so I'll just go over that. I kind of like the sort of individuality it adds to the blocks. It makes them all just a little bit different, rather than all being the same. I think if you wanted to have them all the same, you could measure a bit more accurately, or perhaps foundation paper piece them, something like that. And again, when you have these sticky out bits, you just need to give yourself a straight sewing edge and just repeat that process. So we put that one onto there, and then finally we would put that one onto there. And obviously you would give it a good press, and then you'll have something that looks like this. And this is just sort of one of the many ways that you can use inserts in your quilting. So I've used them for wonky cross quilts, I've used them for tally quilts, hashtag quilts. For those of you that have seen my vegetable patch quilts, so I created a series of quilts that were inspired by vegetables. There are little tomato seeds that were a very similar process, using strips of fabric, background fabric, making a cut somewhere in there and putting it back. So it's nothing revolutionary, it's not, it's not groundbreaking in its execution, but it does enable you to make your quilts a little bit more individual, especially if you use scissors for your cuts, you're not too concerned with your 1/4 inch seam, and you kind of just enjoy the process. And then you could make another one and square it up and then join those into rows to make it easier to come together as a quilt. Or you could make them all different sizes and use what I call a jigsaw method to fit them all together. And you can bring in some additional fabric if you wanted to build up that negative space, perhaps introducing more of your grout fabric, for example. Another thing that you can do is you can use the template of one piece to substitute it with something else. So that's really easy to do. When you're cutting the cuts into your blocks, just take one of them and use it as a template to draw onto a different fabric, and then just replace it in the composition, so you have a little bit of interest that way. And if you love the technique and you want to make these quickly, you can stack fabric. So you can cut maybe 4 or 5 background pieces roughly the same size, layer them on your cutting mat that is not ridiculously small, and make the cuts through all the layers, and then you can reorder those layers. So you could take one from the top and put it on the bottom, and then one from the second layer and put that underneath. And what you will have is little snippets of different fabric within these, and then you would then go ahead and do exactly what we've done, fill in the gaps with this. Obviously, if you're layering fabric, the cuts are the same on however many pieces you have in that stack. So that really works for larger quilts where you can distribute those in different places. But lots of possibilities from something that is really, really simple. So give it a go, see if you like it. But hopefully that's giving you something to think about. Any questions about anything that I've just shown you? No? You're very welcome. Hope you enjoy the show, and remember, do check out not only Kaffe's quilts, but the stunning machines that he's also produced as well. Thank you all so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.